Joe Biden came out and look, in a million years, you can't imagine that the Biden administration wanted the scenes that they saw over the weekend. There is a tactical failure, to say the least. First off, there should have been months ago more willingness and plans to evacuate refugees from Afghanistan. But they were afraid to do so because they're afraid that, I don't know, Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham is going to say, how can you let in all these refugees? I mean, that's just the bottom line.
The Charlie Kirk veto.
Exactly. Or maybe they just don't care. I don't know which one it is. But it's clear there was a massive, purposeful failure there. And then there was obviously a tactical failure of these days. But the reality, and I think Joe Biden admits it, the reality is this was always going to happen. Months ago, when Joe Biden announced it, I, sitting in Brooklyn, who has never come anywhere close to Afghanistan, knew that it was going to happen. It's just a question of when. I don't think anybody anticipated that it would happen, simultaneous with the last airplane that leaves. But and maybe it was going to take a week. Maybe it was going to take 2 weeks, a month, or 3 months, 5 months. But it was going to happen.
Well, of course, the Biden administration, I think, probably underestimated, as does the entire press, the efficacy of the United States occupation there. I mean, essentially, you read these pieces about how the Afghan troops were being funded almost entirely by Pentagon dollars, and then they'd go to ghost soldiers and disappear, and the money wouldn't go anywhere. I mean, we were seen as rubes, as an occupying force that wasn't a benevolent white knight brigade in Afghanistan, but that's the notion that predicates much of how the press frames this. And of course, Biden's not immune to the American exceptionalist view, or Blinken, whoever is on his team. It's a big through line for them.
All right, let's hear Joe Biden's first segment of the speech.
We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure Al-Queda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded Al-Queda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama Bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats.
I mean, the reality is that, to the extent that we have documentation from that time, he was against it. He was against the surge. He probably had more insight than anyone else in the White House as to the failures that were going on there, the failure to build any of the institutions. Everybody knew after 2004 that the Bush administration had pulled everything out of Afghanistan and was in basically just a holding pattern.
All to Iraq.
All to Iraq. And they had failed at Tora Bora to get Bin Laden, which, who knows why that was the case? It was probably incompetence. Incompetence more often than not describes all of this. But there may have also been less relevance. At one point, Bush said, I'm not worried about Osama bin Laden. in 2006 or whatnot. And he may have been no reason to be concerned about bin Laden at that point. But in 2002, when you had an opportunity to catch bin Laden, like I say, probably incompetence, but very convenient if you want to maintain the sense that we as a country are on war footing with terrorism, with a tactic. Because if bin Laden is in jail or has been assassinated by us, it becomes a lot harder to justify.
Well, the wheels were already churning, Sam. I mean, turning. The machine was already kicking itself into high gear, so they couldn't.
You mean in
back
terms
down.
of Iraq?
Yeah.
Oh well, that started almost contemporaneously with Barbara Lee's speech. I mean, the moment we know from Richard Clarke, the moment that the planes hit the tower. I mean, Rumsfeld on September 11th was like, "Get me everything you can to show that Iraq did this."
We haven't.
And they're like,
"Finished the job."
That we don't. What are you talking about? They didn't do this. Yeah. Well, get me everything you have to say that they did do this. And that was the agenda there. But in terms of what you're selling to the American public, and you want to pursue another country that had, and you're pulling out the stops to convince people, the idea that bin Laden's still at large was a helpful, even if there was no, even if reasonable people knew that there was no relationship between bin Laden and Iraq, the idea that he was still out there still maintained this sort of like threat fervor.
The big boss hadn't been brought to justice yet. And we should also say Biden was eager to go to Iraq as well.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, who knows what was in their heart of hearts, but but Biden legitimately did advocate against the surge to the extent that one as vice president can.
Yeah, if you look in Michael Hastings, The Operators, compared to like Hillary Clinton, who was very pro sending more troops to Afghanistan, Biden was skeptical of it.
All right, let's play the next clip.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only a cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there.
I appreciate the strength in that. I mean, there are quibbles I have with the speech in general, like, one, the emphasis on American troops, not really discussion about the civilians and casualties in Afghanistan. It's a political decision, but I think long term, if you're on the party that's ostensibly on the left, you've got to emphasize casualties in the nation that you're occupying. And then the other is that he goes on to blame not in his words, but essentially cowardice of the Afghani government and troops there, which I don't appreciate. But overall, the fact that he did not back down as the cavalcade of media just comes down on him for this decision, and he basically stood firm in it. What can you say? I mean, it was the right move.
Yeah, I don't know what choice he has. I mean, at this point, you can't reverse yourself. I mean, but the reality is that it's been a crap show, that the U.S. military did not prepare the Afghani military to in any way exist without the support of the United States and contractors. They built a military that required air power. The Afghans have no air power. They built a military that required contractors to show them how to operate machinery, how to perform tactics. They had 20 years. And they really did sort of the parody of what all conservatives argue is a problem with government, which is they created a fighting force that was a supplement to what the United States provided it, as opposed to one that could actually stand on its own.
Self-sustaining.
And it's self-sustaining.
Just had them on the take from the Pentagon, as opposed to...
But it's not just a question of a take. It's a question of actually the way that you train them. Do you train them to function, to work with the United States military and contractors? Or do you train them to function on their own? You could provide funding. You could always provide funding. But the military, in a way, created an entity that needed the U.S. military to exist. And so, therefore, the U.S. military was basically ensuring a market for itself in the future, at least trying to. And then the other issue that I think gets lost in a lot of this, and also lost with the 2019 bombing, is the folks who lived outside of Kabul, the majority of Afghanis, we're in the midst of a constant civil war, and we're tired of it. And even if the Afghani army could have stood up on its own, there was just not enough support by the Afghan people to deal with a civil war between the Taliban and the Afghani national army, to the extent that there was one. And I think that was, I think that is something that is underestimated broadly in our press, is that...
Well, what is underlying that underestimation?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things from it. I mean, I think one is sort of just, all of the sort of the patriotism and the sort of the notion that we're in the right. But I think also part of it is also just, the same dynamic of I'm reporting from Kabul, and in Kabul, it's a different sort of life is different than it is out in the countryside.
In rural Afghanistan. I think the underlying assumption that American troops there are a benevolent presence, or one that isn't met by scorn, or at the very least kind of just reluctant acceptance by the Afghani people. I mean, that blows people's minds in the press when you're talking about it. And they're also telling on themselves too when they talk about these images that we're seeing out of the airport in Kabul and around the country, because for 20 years, there has been bloodshed and there has been violence. And under the Bush administration, they weren't publishing a lot of these images to not hurt the war effort. But even in the Obama years and in the Trump years, there were still horrific images coming out of Afghanistan. And only do they care about the violent imagery now when it contradicts American hegemony. Okay. And in a way to justify the occupation. And now we're up in arms. It also has to do with the fact that these newsrooms have completely gutted their, for the most part, international reporting arms. So they really have very little understanding of what's happening there. I'm not an expert, but, that's another wrinkle to the story too.
Worth following Azmat Khan, who was reporting, out in the rural parts of Afghanistan for this perspective on basically just people were tired. It's not even, you don't even have to dislike the U.S. forces. You can just dislike the idea of like there being a war and being in the middle of it and realizing that like the Taliban's not going anywhere. Like they had the advantage they had is that this is their homeland and they have nowhere else to go. And they can just wait, which is basically what they did.
What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. We have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face. But I do not regret my decision to end America's warfighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of Al-Queda in Afghanistan and kill Osama Bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not. And I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest. It is not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment.
A couple of things. One, he's absolutely right that it was sheer cowardice by his predecessors not to end this war. It was cowardice by Obama. It was cowardice by Bush. It was cowardice by Trump setting that date 4 months after he's going to be into his second term. Who knows what would have happened?
Right.
I mean, who knows how he would have responded to the recrimination from the scenes of at the Kabul airport.
Oh, man.
Oh, I just don't know if we would have gotten to that point. I think we could have gotten into May and he would have been like, okay, whatever. I thought this was going to be a selling point. Now just drop another mother of all, bombs on them.
Yeah, we'll do it March 2025.
Or maybe he would have pulled out. We don't know.
He could have made some sort of like Tucker Carlson, they're just, primitive people argument in order to justify it. But regardless, the point is he didn't do it. He didn't do it in his first term. He didn't do it. He could have done it in 2019. He could have done it in 2020. He could have done it at any time. He didn't do it. And Biden deserves credit for that. At one point in the speech, he says, we didn't think it would happen this fast. So they knew this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the only thing ultimately, let's be honest, that they really were concerned with is how can we create the temporal distance between our leaving and this happening. That's what we need to do. We don't want it to be, when they were talking about a Vietnam moment or a Saigon moment, we just don't want it to be so obvious
that we were propping up this government and this society for so long in such a poor fashion that we never, ever let it grow into a thing that could even sustain itself for a day after we leave. And so they wanted to maintain that temporal distance. That's the only thing that they care about. But the failure of Biden here, in my estimation, and, you know, I would be shocked if we have that clip. Yeah, play that clip. Just because I want it to be really clear that they knew this was going to happen. It's just they thought they would have a couple of weeks.
Well, that's why just really quickly he says, you know, he basically talks about the failures of the presidents before him. By the way, no Obama BFF memes right there, is because he understands from behind the scenes that they were grappling with that very question about the optics of leaving more than anything in many respects.
And Obama ran on a surge in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
He was running against Iraq by saying that it took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, which was true. But again, it's like you can't go backwards in time. And the moment of where you had an opportunity, if that's what you wanted, to disempower the Taliban had passed. And
it was
even
just
the surge of whatever it was, 100,000 troops in 2009 or 2010, I think was one of our peaks in terms of deployment, was not going to be enough. Play that last clip of Biden.
We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight.
All right, pause. I don't need to hear the recriminations on the Afghan people who didn't perform as the way that we wanted to, while we were occupying them.
Yeah, that's the most vile part of what he said.
But that part about this happened more quickly than we anticipated. In other words, this was inevitable.
Yeah.
And if you know it's inevitable, right? Like if Joe Biden knows it's inevitable and all the advisors know it's inevitable, the guy in Afghanistan that Joe Biden is relying on, slowing the roll of the Taliban, that guy knows it's inevitable too. And he decided, you know what? I'm not going to stay here and fight so that Joe Biden has the opportunity to say, like, look, it didn't happen for 6 months. Like, I'm going to go now. I can see the writing on the wall. I mean, so for all those people who said, I'm not going to fight, the Afghanis who said, I'm not going to fight or I'm going to walk away, it's because they knew it was inevitable too. Because they did nothing was done by the United States over the course of those 20 years to alter that dynamic fundamentally, to create any type of civil society. And maybe you couldn't do it. My guess is you probably couldn't. But that's an argument as to why we should have left. And the biggest failure, it seems to me, of Biden in this speech, and for the most part, he's being straightforward and then, putting out this sort of pablum like, we shouldn't be in that civil war if they don't want us, if they're not willing to fight for themselves. Well, maybe they're just tired of being bombed. But the bigger failure of Biden here is to make a more comprehensive argument about American invasion and occupation of countries and military intervention. Because we keep getting example after example of how it fails by any measure, whether it's U.S. national security interests or just sheer humanity. And the cowardice that he bemoans about his predecessors to not get out when it was clear that it was wrong is also the cowardice that he's exhibiting by not saying, like, this whole concept that we have the ability to do these things in a way where there's a positive outcome, that concept is also wrong.
It's not cowardice on his part, though, because I still think he believes in that fundamentally.
He might, but then it's just sheer ignorance, because he's staring right into. He's seen two examples of it.
We've had Jeremy Scahill on to talk about Biden as the empire politician. This is a part of his politics, his identity. So within the confines of Biden and who he is, who we know him to be, this was a surprisingly strong speech. But that is the failure, right? Not something I'm going to expect from him to have an anti-imperialist view where we're actually looking at American empire in a critical way. I mean, like, look at how he framed it there. It's all about American troops' lives. It's all about the cowardice of the Afghani people, as opposed to just like, yeah, no one wants to die when there's nothing to die for. It's a lost cause here. That's exactly what it was, as you said.
I think he could even still maintain his perspective
You're coming at it from your perspective.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm saying that he can, I think, even maintain his imperial aspirations, but find a different way. If his aspirations are such, it doesn't help those aspirations to keep failing at these empires. I mean, really, the only these imperial expeditions. The only the only upshot here is to like a couple of weapons manufacturers, stock baseline prices. I mean, that's basically it. There's been no value to even the imperial ambitions.
Don't forget about mercenaries getting rich. Eric Prince, that was a success for him.
Jay or Blackwater, yes, indeed. All right, and I mean, I think that's I don't know what else to say.
I should also say that up until this point, there were many Afghan soldiers that died, and I thought that was particularly insulting to the Afghan soldiers and civilians who also died in this 20-year war. So it's politically expedient for him to blame them and use that to deflect, and we're already seeing in the media that he's trying to pawn it off onto being Trump's plan to some degree. But yes, for the most part, I'm happy he owned it. However, I did find that to be quite vile, even though most of what he said was surprisingly good with his history.
Nerd Cheetah. Even if it wasn't the plan to have Biden leave after one term and attempt to install Harris Mayor Pete administration, do you think Afghanistan will seal the deal on Democratic defeat and make a Paul Ryan, Liz Cheney administration more likely? I would bet every single dollar I own that there will never be a Paul Ryan or a Liz Cheney in the White House.
I mean, like, the crazy thing about this situation is there is a really amazing opportunity. I say amazing not in a positive way, and amazing in a broad way, for him to actually to message this properly, to make this a truly teachable moment. And Biden has, other than just the strategic aspect, flubbed this. Messaging wise, he's flubbed this. If he's going to make it about pulling out, he has done absolutely nothing to explain how Republicans have created this disaster. It's just been, I don't want another administration going through this again, or more lives lost. It's not pointing to Ronald Reagan, because that's exposing who we are as a country.
That was the overall failure. It's just like, why can't we learn a broader lesson to this? This is a huge mistake.
Because that's his ideology.
But that may be that Emma may have the point there. Like it's not even a question of messaging as much as it is like she doesn't want that message out.
Well, he wants to bring the troops home, but he doesn't want to be in conflict with the concept of American empire.
Yes. And he also doesn't want that flubbed on his record. He wants to be known as as the president who was a little bit different. And not, you know, of course, Donald Trump created the scenario for him in which he actually had to do this. And he handled it.
He said that.
Horribly.
He said
horribly.
That. Emma knows corn. My partner works in refugee resettlement. It took Biden months to sign off on the new post-Trump presidential determination, a relatively simple process, which gives the number of refugees the U.S. will accept. Yes, we remember this, right? Like he was going to, originally he said something like 75,000, then they went down to like, well, we're going to let in, 1,200 or something to that effect. And then they had to balance it up. Yes, without a doubt. In other words, the Biden administration actually clogged up that resettlement process more than was necessary in the months leading to this moment. Since January, many small U.S. cities have been waiting to accept more people than the number that have been allowed to come. Indeed, that is the biggest failure, it seems to me.
And just from the perspective of being here in Greece, on top of this, simultaneously, they're shutting down most of the refugee centers in Greece, which shuts everything down for Europe because of the right-wing government that's now in place. So how is that going to play out when, you know, the few places that we're taking refugees globally, where do refugees go? Where do they go?
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.